later, later this month, Mori are publishing some new material on perceptions and the way that people see immigrant populations and others, and the misperceptions that they often have. I was very struck working with the British Chamber of Commerce and others that while the perception was that a lot of East European immigration was into low-paid, low-level, basic jobs, business leaders actually said that many of the European immigrants who came over after the 2002-2003 expansion were actually extremely highly qualified, highly motivated, and had often had multiple languages, many of them having some part of higher education. And we often complain that we don't know enough about the inflows and outflows of immigration in this country. How much do we know about the inflows and outflows amongst immigrant communities themselves? So, for instance, are there not already some signs that qualified, educated Poles may be looking to go back to Poland or take up jobs in Germany, where they often have language skills? Are there these kinds of flows that are just simply not on anybody's radar?
Well, I think a range of misperceptions are very important in debates, but we're very cautious about thinking that, I mean, and the Mori work is very, very good on this, we're very cautious about the idea that if you go and correct those misperceptions, you say, look, if you understood the evidence how we do, you'd see it how we do, because the person who's saying that is always from a graduate background, doing quite well in business, so people just pick up, well, this you're talking past me again, because it's working for people like you and you're not listening for why what works for you doesn't work for me. So the misperception itself, the feeling the number is higher than it is, the pace is faster than it is, reflects the concern. You've got to go to the underlying concern. It was important in the national conversation, 600 people representative of the 60 areas we were in having a face-to-face conversation. A tenth of those people were foreign born. There would be people who'd been living in Leicester for 30 years and people who'd come from Poland or Belgium 3 or 4 years ago. And what was very interesting was there was a lot of agreement in principle about what makes migration and integration work. You know, if you meet Poles, they'll be very tough on people who don't want to work, people who don't learn the language. But it's surprising for the British participants to hear that's where the Polish participants are. So again, that contact really helps. People say, I had no idea that you thought it was really important for people to learn English. Maybe we've got some common ground here. But also the experience is very different. Southampton, for example, is a place with a very well integrated, upwardly mobile Polish community that's very much part of a city that understands waves of migration over time. If you go to Lincolnshire, Grimsby and so on, there's much more social distance between East Europeans and the host community because they're perceived as recent. But most people in most places, Jill, have met some Poles. No?
Yes, I mean, as Sunder said, social contact really matters because it gives you an alternative world view. I mean, this kind of cognitive bias, facts and figures don't change views unless they actually concur with people's internal narratives, internal story about immigration. And I think the challenge is to kind of shift this personal narrative rather than throw facts and figures at people.
Do you think that happened in the summer when the government changed policy on some of the high-skilled people working in the National Health Service? Was that because of the numbers, or was that because there was enough of a narrative going round a very big community that people could actually understand it and see it in their hospitals and other places, and knew and heard stories about not being able to fill doctors' posts or others? Is it that kind of localised story, something happening in their area? Is that the kind of thing that might change government policy in other areas? Or
I think there are a couple of areas where government policy is tough and it just completely fails a common sense test for everybody, and not letting NHS trusts get doctors they want when there are waiting lists, and why you just students fall into that camp anyway. I think if that argument had gone on and the NHS trusts had continued to localise it, and people would have said, what's going on? Interesting, as with Windrush, this makes the people who are sceptical really angry, because they start saying, we haven't got a clue what you're doing, we want you to get a grip on that, and then because can't do that at all. You're now doing this daft thing of turning down doctors. I mean, what planet are you living on? So it adds to this whole point about what's there. On the other hand, mostly, if it wasn't, doctors are needed to deal with this waiting list, most of the causes that most sectors would have about their worries about the Brexit labour supply just won't be salient. So I think there are real limits for business advocates about how far the needs of tech or the needs of the universities or the needs of social care might be a bit different are going to land. You're going to have to get the overall system right, because you can't, you can do opt-outs for farmers, opt-outs for everyone. Once everyone wants an opt-out, you haven't got a policy anymore.
And just looking outside the UK border, do you think there's the possibility or the threat of a new settlement in Europe? I mean, populist pressures are rising in a number of other countries. The stress on Mrs. Merkel's coalition from her own immigration policies, different countries possibly having not point systems, but deciding they're going to operate much more control and perhaps less freedom of movement. I mean, is there a new settlement in prospect which might affect perceptions of immigration in this country?
I think there's a really big challenge to, governments, political elites, business elites across Europe, and people don't know how to do it. I would say, populist pressures in Germany are probably a bit more moderate than they are in most other countries, but it's such a shock in Germany to have a populist challenge at all in the scale of the culture of the Federal Republic. You look at what's going on in Italy and some of the things that come out of the, Mr. Salvini. It's well to the right of anywhere Donald Trump would go, and it's a set of things being said, and in Hungary as well, by the mainstream politicians. Orban is still in the European People's Party, and the scale of his of his rhetoric about what Hungary won't accept. So I think all of these debates about who are we debates about Britain, about France, about the Netherlands, about Germany, you can see them as international, but if you try and solve them on an international sphere, you're kind of taking it out of the local and national debate. Something very strange has happened in Britain that I think wasn't expected. There's very strong evidence now from Ipsos Mori, British Social Attitudes and others, and our work, that attitudes have got considerably warmer since 2016. And if you're a Guardian or Financial Times reader, you say, oh, it's really getting out of hand, isn't it? It'll be the 1930s next. And yet attitudes have got warmer, but for two completely different reasons. People who felt a sense of threat by the scale, felt powerful when the Leave vote came in, think something's going to change, they don't know what it is, and so they feel change is on the way. So if some change happens, that's okay. People on the other side of the debate feel incredibly empathetic about the 3 million Europeans in Britain. I mean, that's a view held across the spectrum, because people don't understand why, a lot of people don't understand why Europeans have taken the vote as personally as they did. And Europeans in Britain don't understand why people can't see they didn't take it personally. So there's actually a softening of attitudes in Britain if we take this opportunity, but there might be a hardening of attitudes elsewhere because the Swedish government or the German government or the Italian government is either stoking it or hasn't been seen to get to grips with it.
I think we've got to get refugee protection rights in individual European countries as well. What happens in Calais really does affect attitudes in Britain, and we found in the national conversation on immigration, a lot of people talked about the movement of refugees and migrants across Europe, which they perceived as people being drawn to Britain through the perceived generosity of its welfare system. So I think individual European Union countries have got to get refugee protection and refugee integration rights, integration in particular.